when did the term climate change really come into use? Obviously, scientists may have known about it, but was it the 90s? It seems to have been with us forever.
It does seem to be a long time, doesn't it? It's at least, I suppose, the 1970s, but probably before that. But equally, it's had reinventions. It's gone from being called climate change to global warming, and then back towards climate change.
Global warming. That was going to kill us all at one time. I want to come on to this as well. And obviously, the skeptics. I'll play devil's advocate here. The skeptics have always been with us. In the 1970s, the world was going to die of pollution because pollution was the big thing. Everybody discovered pollution. And that got sorted. The ozone layer was going to fry us all because we had the wrong sort of fridges, and that seemed to disappear. Who's to say climate change won't just dry up and blow away?
I think it's so much larger.
You've heard that before, haven't you?
I have. so much larger and measured value globally. And what I mean by that, there's more confidence that we know about it now because in the 1970s, the planet was orbited by just a few satellites. But in the last 10 to 20 years, we have now got a greater network of satellites taking all these measurements globally, so we can be more confident that it is a global phenomenon. It's not just an ozone hole type event, which was over the Antarctic, and thankfully that is reducing in size because of changes in laws about what type of gases you can use in fridges. CFCs. But essentially that had an impact over the Antarctic. But the satellite evidence is that globally now it's everywhere. Every country's producing some carbon footprint, some more than others, like our friends in China and I suppose India, as I mentioned, but also
on the other side as well, of course, there are forests disappearing in Brazil.
Well, there's the other one. The deforestation effect is something that I think has possibly been underestimated and forgotten about. It's almost like the drivers for climate change sort of go in and out of fashion, and somehow the inconvenient truth, I think it was called once. There's all this going on, but people are not seeing it. And one of them was deforestation. And that has a big impact because a lot of that deforestation happens in the tropics. And where's the biggest heat input to the planet? It's in the tropics. And if you can't control the heat energy balance around the tropics, potentially you're in trouble. You're losing, when you lose trees, you go down to the bare land. The land warms up a lot hotter than what it would have done when it was covered in trees.
Well, they talk about the rainforest. They're carbon sinks, aren't they? They absorb carbon.
That's the other thing about the forests is that they were the carbon sink as well. They were the lungs of the planet.
The basis of photosynthesis, isn't it? Absorbing carbon dioxide, exhaling oxygen.
Absolutely, yes. And also, in their own way, some sort of control over the soil moisture content and indeed the moisture content of the atmosphere on that part of the planet. So very, very important to have large forests. If you remove those forests, it's going to have a climate change impact.
This has been with us for years. There was, people who are old enough will remember there was a campaign called Plant a Tree in 73. 73. 45 years ago, 46 years ago, Plant a Tree in 73. So the fact that, when anything green that grows is good for the environment. And if you get rid of stuff that's green that grows, you obviously will have an impact. And numbers don't lie. I say that to a physicist. He looks back at me and says, of course they don't. Numbers don't lie. If you cut down green things that grow, you will have an impact on the other end. And forestation, is that an answer to it? Is that a help to it, to reforest places?
Well, I certainly believe so. The mitigating input by planting new massive forests would make a big difference. But even at a local scale, I suppose, if smaller countries can make sure that they plant new plantations and also consider in their planning, as they're building new areas in cities, are those buildings all going to be concrete or not, or can they? I've seen some exciting things being done elsewhere in the world, such as in Singapore, where the new buildings also have a lot of trees planted on them around the balconies and on the rooftops, and all these small contributors to capturing carbon and cleaning up the air and the natural processes in cities may be a little difference that makes a difference.
Well, sure, the Isle of Man must be a positive contributor. The Isle of Man can't get any greener than it is, can it?
Well, there you go. We're living in this lovely lump of rock in the Irish Sea. It's a green lump of rock. We've got our biosphere status, and we have got our plantations and our green fields, and that all helps us. And we like to think that we're in a very clean place, and we are. But I'm more concerned that the external influences around us are going to impact even on us, although we're doing our bit to stay green.
It's a bit like politically and financially. The Isle of Man can only ride the horse it's given in terms of finance, in terms of things like Brexit. The Isle of Man has no influence whatsoever over Brexit. We basically have to play which hand we're given. And in terms of climate, it's the same thing. We may be running a very clean shop on the Isle of Man, but it's like Bill Dale and his boys collecting plastic every weekend. It comes from somewhere else. We have to clean up after other people. Adi, I want to talk about, do you know much about reverse desertification at all?
I don't know.
Reverse desertification, because one of the problems in the world are the deserts are getting bigger. And as you say, and just run this by me again, flat ground with no vegetation, heats up quicker, stores more heat? How does that work?
Okay, yeah. So ground will heat up more. Flat ground, rock, or soils will heat up more than green land or forest land or the oceans. So the more brown land, I'll use that terminology, brown land that you have, the more heating you get on the land surfaces, and also the land can act as a storage heater. It will grab that heat and retain it. So that's a big concern, really.
One of the big problems, in Africa, wherever there are big deserts, the Gobi, Sahara, in the middle of the United States, the deserts are getting bigger. So, if you like, this desertification creeps out from a desert. What has to be done is to reverse that. And there are ways. The science is there, and you know yourself. You're a scientist. Science conquers everything in the end if we get it right. Turning the deserts back into fertile, arable land is something that will help, and so that's a part of science. And I want to talk to you a bit about science and its power for good. If we can reverse the desertification of vast areas of Africa, because Africa, I keep coming back. The Isle of Man is small. We may run a very clean shop, but we can't affect anything globally. The big tracts of land, South America, Africa, Asia, they're the ones, and as you say, with China and India pumping out thousands, millions of tons of carbon into the air every day by burning coal, these are the places that have to alter it. So how do you play a part as a person, as one person? How do you play a part in helping the world get a bit better? What can anyone do?
Well, I suspect we can all do our little bit, and it just feels like it's such a small percentage difference. But of course, if everybody did their little bit, it starts to add up, if you add up all the pennies. Now, I suppose that might be how we use energy in our own buildings. Our buildings should be better insulated. I think it's also how we use energy for producing electricity. The cleanest energy possible is the way forward, perhaps. And indeed, so many countries are meeting their climate change challenge by bringing in alternative means of energy provision. Windy places, it works very well. You can have these massive wind farms, and that sort of essentially reduces your carbon footprint. And the other one, going back to deserts, that's caught my eye, is you start covering some of these desert areas with acres and acres of solar panels.
Right. Now that obviously will be a way you could power everything if you'd put those in there. Let's come back to energy generation then. Where do you stand on wind power?
Yeah, I was always a bit suspicious about what's going on there. I used to think in the early days, as a physicist, that the wind farms around the British Isles was actually being self-invented by the industry. That we can make wind turbines, and this is what we can do, and we're selling them. And by the way, they cost £10 million each or whatever. But more recently, now that I've seen some of the figures of the generation outputs that are coming from the modern wind turbines, I'm starting to be convinced that they're worth making at that price to get a return of cheap energy from the wind.
Well, you would hope. All technology is expensive in the beginning. You get to a critical mass and it starts to make a bit more sense. And obviously, the electricity market is a market. You know, it's a futures market. People buy the interconnector that's literally half a mile from us down at Port Skillion, goes across to Bispam. So that's buying and selling alternating current all the time. So and in the end, we live in a capitalist society. Things have to make financial sense. Overarching, though, climate change is going to happen come what may, and having more money is no use to us if we're surrounded by brick walls keeping the sea out. You mentioned 3 feet. The Maldives would go completely. Holland would be surrounded by. I mean, it's surrounded by walls anyway, and the Dutch are very good at managing their coastline. It would suddenly become of stark importance to many, many people, and then it will be too late. So let me ask you for a date, Adi. When do we have to sort it out by?
Well, looking at all the climate change models, and they're run internationally by different climate change model centres, and the one in the UK is run by the Hadley Centre, part of the UK Met Office, and its predictions agree with other international centres of prediction that we have to really sort out in the next 50 to 100 years.
So let's say that would be by 2070. It has to be.
Absolutely.
It has to be sorted. If not, it'll just carry on. It'll have a momentum of its own.
It will. And
we don't really know what might happen.
Well, this is the thing. It's the best knowledge at the moment, the climate models that they're running, that they're fairly confident this will happen in the next 30 to 50 years. But it's the rate of change that may be a bit more unpredictable. And the changes after that, of course, are stretching the limits of the models. But all climate change scenarios, depending on the carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, how that works out and limiting that, all scenarios produce a change in temperatures upwards of 1.5 or 2 degrees. The worst case scenario is a temperature rise of 4 degrees. And you'd also have an increase in the temperature of the oceans, and it's that thermal expansion of the oceans that is the key for coastal communities like the Isle of Man, whether you're going to get 30 centimetres of sea level rise, or are you going to get that peak value that they've come up with of 94. The most likely climate change scenario for the Isle of Man is in the range of 60 to 65 centimetres, just to sort of reduce that 3-foot figure we were talking about. The most likely one by 2070 is going to be maybe closer to up to 2 feet extra sea level.
Now, for people who are closer to the end of their life than the start of their life, and I class myself as one of those people, we'll never know it. It's young people today. It's people in their teens nowadays who will have to pick this up when they're in middle age. So how do you get the message to young people? Because obviously I know you have visitors, and the Met Office reaches out to the education system as well. Do they get it, Adi?
I think they do. It's being well put across in the schools, as far as I can see, by the geography departments, for instance. And I do get invites to go and speak to groups of sixth formers. And I usually go to talk, about the weather, but I also try to put an emphasis on, well, your generation's going to have to deal with climate change. Although we're starting to look at it now and starting to take mitigating actions, reducing carbon emissions and building up some strength and height to our infrastructure around our coastal communities, and planning perhaps bigger and better drainage systems around new buildings. The people that are going to have to live with it and work with it going on are the people who are in the secondary schools now. And I said to them the other day, I envy you, because you're going to have exciting times, but also scary times, because of what could happen in your lifetime. But equally, some of them are going to be in a position to make decisions or do research that will help all people adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change.
Now, long-term changes in weather patterns are something that affect everybody. They cause biotic processes to change, solar radiation, human activity, plate tectonics for all that mean. The change of the climate of the Earth has all sorts of implications. Potential extinction of various species. It affects the oceans, the forests, the glaciers, the clouds as well. So we look at cleaner energy, the infrastructure, what's going to happen to our infrastructure, ecological politics as well. The weather used to be so simple, Adi. It's flipping everywhere now. You're in the right job, it has to be said.
And you could say it's actually a growth industry, weather and climate change, because there is such a focus now on the impact and the scenarios. So it's generating its own industry to do research.
When you were talking about the problems that are going to be faced by future generations, I just cast back 100 years. The problems used to be of conflict and war, and parts of the globe fighting each other. This is something everybody has to pull together on, because the weather knows no boundaries, does it?
Well, that's right. There's no walls. Not even Donald Trump could put up a wall that's big enough to stop the atmosphere moving.
You can't stop clouds.
You can't. But it's interesting that COP24 was a conference of the United Nations, representatives from all the countries of the world, to try to agree a document going forward on how they would combat climate change. And most countries accepted that report and a working document for the instructions, shall we say. What are you going to do after 2020? What are you going to do after 2024? There were some exceptions. Most countries agreed to accept the report, and there were a few countries who would not accept the report. They only noted the report, and those countries were the US, Russia, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia.
Now, disease is something that I want to bring up as well now, because with the change in the climate, what used to be temperate could become tropical. So things like dengue fever, Lyme disease, diseases could become malaria. You could find, malaria is something that's restricted to the tropical zones. Now, if suddenly what used to be temperate becomes tropical, and that may happen, we don't know that it would, but it may happen. The balance of power, the balance of how people approach life would change radically, completely, perhaps irreversibly as well. So because of the fact that the climate change may tip things upside down, have there been any projections as to what may happen regarding tropical areas versus temperate areas? You mentioned the Isle of Man. Let's just say, let's go out on a limb and say, will the Isle of Man get colder or hotter if climate change happens?
It will get warmer. And the scenarios for the climate change in our neck of the woods is in a low emission scenario, on average, 0.5 degree warmer than what we are now. Bearing in mind that I've already said that we're already 1 degree above pre-industrial level.
You obviously, and people may not know it, so I'll put it on record. I mean, every day you take thousands of statistics at Ronaldsway, and of course, there's a one time every day when every Met Office in the world takes a particular temperature.
Yes, globally, the international Met Offices have agreed to take their measurements at 9 o'clock GMT in the morning, 9 o'clock GMT in the evenings. So that is when everybody measures their maximum and their minimums.
Right.
And the outlier for the Isle of Man, by the way, just to go back to the scenario with the high emissions scenario, the Isle of Man could be up to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than what it was the pre-industrial times, and wetter. As we said earlier, a warmer climate can carry more moisture, more energy. Yes. So it goes hand in hand. It would be a wetter climate, wetter and milder.
And I just want to go, I don't want to frighten anybody, but disease travels in warm and wet weather.
It does.
So I know particularly, I'm trying to think, it was Madeira, the one off the African coast. They got dengue fever two years ago. Dengue fever blew from Africa and went to Madeira, and many older people died. I know because I have some friends who live in Madeira, and they told me about it. It doesn't make the news, but that's one consequence of what may happen. If things do get warmer and wetter, that's what carries disease, and that's what could happen. Transport is a big thing as well, and particularly in America. America uses more cars than anybody else. America contributes, I'm trying to think, something like 20% of carbon emissions. So cars and trucks, 20% of carbon emissions in America.
Yep.
Transport. Do you think transport is going to have to change in the future? Personal transport particularly.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing the evidence of that already, even within the UK now, that people are refusing to buy vehicles such as diesel vehicles. That's reduced. Did you see that report from Jaguar Land Rover? Their sales of diesel motors was down by over 20%. And they've been caught sort of napping almost, because there's other countries that have already had their manufacturers move towards cleaner petrol engines and battery technology, and Jaguar Land Rover need to catch up on that.
But this is where the consumer gets confused, because 20 years ago the future was diesel. Everybody talked about buying diesel cars. And then Volkswagen got caught fiddling the figures with their technology, with their software, and suddenly the consumer gets left with a diesel vehicle. I speak as someone who drives a diesel vehicle.
Same here.
They said, do you remember? They said, "Oh, get a turbo diesel. It's the best thing in the world."
That's efficient.
That's it. There was only one person who said diesels were wrong. It was Jeremy Clarkson. Jeremy Clarkson used to say it. He said that diesels were bad now. So the consumer gets left holding a vehicle. So and now the choice will be: do you buy an electric vehicle, or do you buy a hybrid? Is it a hybrid, or because obviously electric vehicles have to be charged, and that electricity is going to come from a fossil fuel power station.
Yes.
So the consumer at the end is left with this choice as to what to do. Do you go electric, or do you go hybrid? So Eddie and I have got diesel cars, so we're responsible. We're responsible for all this. Adrian Cowin is going to be with us for the Manning Line after 1 o'clock today. We're going to check. If there's any point you want to make, by the way, somebody's messaged in and said, and I don't know whether this is true, so they may be winding me up, but the golden toad is the first species to be extinct due to climate change. So I'll find out about the golden toad. Air conditioning, apparently, somebody said, uses enormous amounts of fossil fuel, and air conditioning is very, very big, isn't it?
Absolutely it is. And in a warming climate, more and more countries with affluent societies, people are wanting their air conditioning.
And you mentioned China and you mentioned India. Now, again, going back 50 years, two of the poorest countries on earth. So they're making strides to improve the lot of their people, and they're using carbon-intensive technology to do it. So you can understand why they would turn around when they're being told what to do by the educated, affluent West. Don't do that. They're saying, well, you did it 50, 60 years ago. Why shouldn't we do it now? Are there ways of burning coal more efficiently nowadays than they used to be, do you think?
I suspect not greatly more efficiently. There's probably been some improvements in coal power stations. But of course, the Chinese and Indian industries are growing so quickly that they can't build their coal-fired power stations quickly enough. And I suspect because of that, they're chucking them up with basic technology, and they're basically what I'd call dirty power stations, churning out a lot of greenhouse gases.
Is the villain carbon?
It is, absolutely, yes.
Why? What's a greenhouse gas, by the way?
Okay, so a greenhouse gas is the biggest greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, and there are other small contributors, and they get captured in the atmosphere, and they retain this. They upset the energy balance of the planet again. They retain some of the radiation of the planet. And when I say radiation, I'm talking about the infrared radiation that would normally reflect back out into space. The atmosphere with a greater amount of carbon dioxide in it, that infrared radiation gets scattered back into the atmosphere or down towards the planet, hence the net warming of the atmosphere.